I'll do that right now. So a very big welcome to everybody. My name's Tristan McCowan, and this is the third webinar of Climate U, which is the Transforming Universities for a Changing Climate project. And this webinar is called Participatory Action Research, Universities and Climate Justice. It's really great to have you all here for the live webinar, and also for those joining us watching the recording. It's a huge pleasure to have our speakers here today, who I will introduce shortly, and also all of you who are attending, and we will carve out as much time as possible for you to give your views on this work. It's very much a constructive piece. It's something that's been brought together through interactions over many months by members of the team, and we hope also to join you into that discussion of creating this work. So I'll start by saying a little bit about our research project, which will put in context the discussions today around this working paper. So Climate U is a 3-year Global Challenges Research Fund project, which is working between 5 countries, Kenya, Mozambique, Fiji, Brazil, and the UK, with partner universities in each of those countries. And the primary aim of the project is to understand and to strengthen the role of universities in addressing climate change. And there are many aspects to the research, but the central one is participatory action research, and that's going to be the main topic of our webinar today. So the project is based on the principle that addressing climate change will only be effective if it is and for that reason, we have a strong principle within the project that we need high quality, vibrant higher education systems, higher education institutions and universities in all contexts. And it's those local connections of the universities in addition to address the critical. And for that reason, the centerpiece of the research is participatory action research groups that are set up in 12 universities across the 4 countries, and which will be carrying out their own interventions, their own participatory and learning and transformative process with a range of different remits. So the universities in the different countries will be focusing on connections with communities, with transforming their own campuses, public engagement of various different forms. So that's a little of the background to the project. What we will be looking at today, and the speakers will introduce it in greater detail, is a working paper that deals with the underpinning principles, the theoretical background and the methodology of participatory action research, but drawing on some of the experiences of the different countries. Now, the working paper has already been published. If you don't have that, I will put the link in the chat soon so you can all have access to that easily, or find it afterwards on our website. I'll also put our project website there. It's now my great pleasure to introduce the speakers. Firstly, Rosiana Lagi, who is our co-investigator for the Climate U project and the lead for Fiji. She is Deputy Head of School for Pacific Arts Communication and Education at the University of the South Pacific, a specialist in Indigenous knowledge and climate change, has previously worked in Tuvalu, has now returned to Fiji, star of a number of YouTube documentaries, so has a budding new career in that field, and it's a real pleasure to have her with us today to speak to this working paper that she had a key role in. Our second speaker is Alex Frediani, also co-investigator on our project with Climate U. Used to be a colleague of mine at UCL, has moved just down the road. Well, he hasn't moved out of his living room, I suppose, like the rest of us, but notionally has moved down the road to the International Institute for Environment and Development, where he's principal researcher, leading the thematic group on housing justice. Alex will be well known to many of you in different communities, whether in urban planning, housing justice, community outreach work of universities, the capabilities approach. He's very active in a number of areas, both intellectually, but also in terms of mobilizing and practical political work. So it's a huge pleasure to have Alex with us as well. Finally, our third speaker, Frances Koya, who is our country advisor for Fiji. And she is currently team leader for Culture for Development at SBC, the Pacific Community. So she's moved out of university role recently and is developing her engagements with communities and policy, but was previously director of the Oceania Center for Arts, Culture and Pacific Studies at University of the South Pacific. She's a leading light in Indigenous pedagogies and sustainability in the region and beyond. It's an enormous pleasure to have Frances here, who will be giving the response to the paper. Alex and Rosie both involved in the writing of it. I would also like to acknowledge Charlie Nussey, who had an absolutely crucial role in the writing and the development of the paper. She won't be speaking today as part of the panel, as she's been unwell, but we're very pleased that she's been able to attend. And I would like just to acknowledge the really important role she had in the writing of the paper and the organizing of it as well. We will start very shortly with a presentation from Alex and then Rosie, and then we'll move on to the response from Frances. But just before I do that, I would like to say, for the questions, we are very happy to have your questions either in a written form. So if you like at any point during the webinar, just write your question or comment in the chat. And either I will read it out, or preferably, if you're able to, I will ask you to ask your question directly, or you can simply raise your hand or get my attention in some other way once we enter the discussion, which will be for the last 40 minutes or so of the session, and we can do it that way. So if you think of your questions as we're going along, just put it in the chat, and then we sort of mark your place in the queue. Otherwise, you can contribute when the inspiration takes you at the end of the discussions. Without further ado, I will hand over to Alex for the first presentation.
Great. Thank you, Tristan, for this introduction. And it's great to be sharing this panel with Rosie and Frances. Really looking forward to this conversation. It was a really exciting process of putting together this working paper with all the partners and with Charlie. I think both of us have been in a really great position to be able to do that and to be collaborating with such a great team that has been part of this process. So what I will do now is to share some reflections about the paper, how it came about, and some underpinning notions related to it, and then finish with some questions, which are the questions that we are hoping to continue reflecting about through the experience of setting up those participatory action research groups. Can you see my screen? Is that okay? Yeah.
We can see it fine. Yes.
Great, fantastic, thanks. So why a protocol? I mean, what the paper does is to outline a set of principles and stages and questions that what we're calling it's a protocol for participatory action research. And we thought that it was important in our collaboration for us to discuss collectively and to shape together what is participatory action research, what is it supposed to be achieving, and how do we implement that in practice. And we thought that before we even start implementing that, for the groups to start setting up their participatory action research group activities, we thought it would be useful to start to build maybe a shared set of concepts or notions or preoccupations that will be useful to help to inform each of the group's activities, as well as to have facilitate knowledge sharing across the it was really with that intention of, from all the collaborators, share the notions and understandings and coming from their own different set of practices and experiences, so that we could collectively exchange ideas about it. So it was with this in mind, with this idea of nurturing conversations, for sharing knowledge and experiences around the idea of participatory action research, which we thought would be useful to actually to do this, and to do this in a really collaborative way. What I will share with you is some of those points of departure, and also some of the nuances that came also from those conversations, and how they inform the development of this protocol. So in terms of the point of departure, we really started from definitions of participatory action research that was rooted on the work of pedagogues such as Paulo Freire, which articulates the idea of participatory action research associated to an universal right to participate in the process of knowledge production. And I think that is really a really fundamental component for us as a departure, in the sense of challenging the systems and the processes embedded in knowledge production. And the idea that also came from Fausto Borda, when he argues, a Colombian pedagogue, when he argues that we will only be able to address the injustices in our society if we addresses the asymmetries of power embedded in the knowledge, in knowledge production. A similar type of motivations also in Boaventura da Silva Santos, that also work through similar lens. And when Paulo Freire describes what is then a participatory action research, he talks about a disciplined process of personal and social transformation. I think this resonated a lot with us, with this idea of connecting to a more personal sense of agency, and how those personal processes of liberation can be promoted through participatory action research, but as well as a more societal transformation, how it can also have a role in addressing some of those societal relations. So, as Paulo Freire would, as for those familiar, would what he would do is to then connect this to a process of rupture of existing silences and accommodation passivity, and engage into a process of gaining confidence and abilities to unjust conditions and structures. His work is also famous to be linked to the idea of conscientization, conscious awareness. So that's where he's getting into. I think another very interesting, I think, definition for us that that was important to bring to the project is this idea that this transformative endeavor is in a way unembarrassed to label itself political, and unafraid to consume the relationship with emancipatory consciousness. And I think that's I think all of the groups have really, and all the teams in the different countries engaged into this process are intended to engage politically into what is that is shaping the climate injustices that we're experiencing, and also how can universities play a more significant role in trying to deal with those climate injustices. And so all of the groups have that intention to embrace that this political label, and being unembarrassed to engage politically with some of those processes. So then if we were to think about some dimensions of participatory action research, I think we've been talking about 5 different key elements that I think characterize activities around participatory action research that comes from the literature, but also they have been discussed and thought through how they would be useful in the particular context and also situations of the different partners. First one is around knowledge and action that address real problems. So I think that in setting up those participatory action research groups within those different universities, there is a real preoccupation to focus around real problems that people are facing in their everyday life, and how to think about knowledge that can be produced to relate to that, and that can be drawing on that as well. Secondly, there is a process that unmasks these political aspects of knowledge production. So I think in all of the cases, there is an explicit critique around where, how knowledge is being produced, what are the dominant actors producing knowledge around climate change, and how can we address those processes and trying to again recognize marginalized voices and experiences that have been affected by climate change, and how they can be included and recognized and embedded into this process. So I think there's a clear orientation to try to understand those silences, how those silences is happening, why they are happening, and how can, through the participatory action research activities, there might be other forms of recognition of marginalized voices and experiences. So the groups are intending to generate concrete actions, and there are different ideas already bubbling. So they are there with the intention to alter conditions and experiences of injustices. So there is, in some of the cases, about setting up an office inside the university focused on climate change issues to try to then galvanize kind of social mobilization within the university and its partners to change attitudes and institutional norms and procedures within the universities. In other cases, it's about the community engagement aspect of how then the university can be more active in supporting local schools, in generating material that relates to climate change. So there's different actions that are coming out, and it's a very exciting moment to be at this stage of the project where the groups are starting to meet and concrete actions are starting to emerge. The groups are also focusing building theory through practice and through core learning. So the research aspect that we have is related to the kind of theory that we want to build, the knowledge that we want to generate, which is related to the operations of participatory action research, and what role can they play in supporting and making universities more active in responding to climate injustices. So I think this is the type of learning that we want to generate by sharing the experiences of how this is happening in the different universities part of the network. Then we are hoping to then generate knowledge through their practices, and then knowledge that is generated through this process of co-learning, of collaborative learning about our experience. So we have a strong emphasis on the documentation of the learning as much as on the activation of the practice of the actions that the groups are going to be doing. And finally, as processes of participatory action research goes, it's a cyclical process. So it's not linear. It's one that is very iterative, that has moments of alterations, and what the different groups are trying to do is to facilitate those cycles of conversations, of analysis, of reflection, of action, and so forth, that hopes to nurture also collective networks that is then aimed to bring about change within the universities and the partners that they work with on the ground. So it's another aspect of participatory action research that we're hoping to encourage. So the paper outlines some different stages that came from these conversations, and it was really interesting that for us, we started from an identification of the sites of impact. We realized that actually there are very different sites of impacts that participatory action research groups can focus on. Some of them might be related to the community engagement work that universities are doing. Some others might be to do with curriculum development. Some others are around operations of universities. And each of those have a constellation of different actors. And there could be even different pathways for achieving an impact in relation to those different sites. So I think the first set of activities that we hope we were doing with our partners, and they're still doing at the moment with the members of the groups, is to refine this site of impact. What's the site of impact? In that sense, it brought up two very important principles of participatory action research for us, which is around being strategic as well as being iterative. So how to manage these two elements, which is one is trying to build that strategic vision of the type of change that the group is trying to bring about. At the same time, being open and flexible, iterative, being informed by the ongoing activities to be able to reformulate some of those strategic directions. And here we then draw on particular tools that members of the network have been using. And in this case, the paper explores the theory of change as a tool that could be useful for groups when thinking about those things. The second stage that we talked about is around identifying group participants and roles, which we find is really important once the groups are formed. And so what is the actual roles and responsibilities of different members of the group. And we start seeing that that groups start building like more like core participants, and then there's extended participants, which is related to many of the actors that groups want to achieve impact, where they want to influence. So it's what was interesting to keep this broader network as a way to bring, let's say, that the target audience from the beginning of the process, and keeping them part of the group's activities. So in that sense, it's about being grounded, and it's also about that set of relationships to be built on relationships of equity, of equivalence. So in the sense, is about making sure that those roles and responsibilities are done in an emancipatory way, that there is not any form of exclusions, or there is also, we're avoiding forms of extractions, but actually very, based on the principles of equitable partnership. And again, here there is a series of tools that came from partners, ways that they've been doing this type of analysis within participatory action research group activities. The third area of work is around convening the group in terms of also, and again, those are not stages that necessarily come one after the other, but they are maybe spaces of activities that we brought together, and then thinking about the relationship between them. But the convening of the group is a key element of the implementation of participatory action research groups, in ways that also can facilitate collective immersions. And again, we are in a very difficult moment, because we were hoping that we would be able to get groups to go into particular sites, to see particular realities, to be able to recognize different experiences of climate change, so that it can inform the discussions and the collective work. But with the COVID context, this has been a very difficult thing to achieve, and I think some of the work has been done even remotely. So again, those are some of the things that we're having to deal with through the process of implementation. And it's within that context that Rosie, Dr. Rosiana Lagic, she produced a really insightful contribution on community engagement, drawing on her experience in Fiji. So we're going to hear a bit more from her around this a bit later on. And then there is another set of activities which are around planning and action. So the planning, the actual implement, the intervention, the initiative that the group would like to do, and that is based on principles of co-production, co-creation, of again including diverse perspectives and experience into that process of planning and in implementing processes. And finally, we also have this focus on the strategy of documentation, which relates to having a MEL framework, we call the monitoring, evaluation, and learning framework, where we are hoping that we will be able to document the process, to try to document from the beginning and use as a way to help the group to identify what is the priorities of the group, what is the experiences happening in the group, how can the group can be more inclusive, more deliberative, and more impactful as well. And so we are hoping that there will be a set of qualitative methodologies as well as quantitative methods to try to document this experience. This diagram is then in the paper represented in this beautiful way that it was then produced by David Heyman, a graphic designer, part of another research project, and did this beautiful illustration, where then it recognized all the different principles that I was just relating to now, and the different activities related to the steps or the stages of participatory action research that I was just describing. And I want to finish with some questions. Questions that we have in this process, and I think it's questions also that's ongoing, and in this conversation we feel it will be very useful to inform the development of those questions and reflections around them. The first one is how to go beyond the project. So how can participatory action research activities have some traction beyond the implementation of a particular activity or an intervention? And in that sense, what we're thinking through is around how can participatory action research activities lead to more empowered learning systems, how the learning systems within which the participatory action research activities is embedded, how they can be they can be strengthened, they can be made more inclusive or more emancipatory in some way. So that's the kind of a reflection that we have in terms of how to make the university system and the learning spaces that exist within the university network. So also talking about the collaboration between university, communities, policymakers, etc. So all the system of learning within which universities are embedded, how to make them more emancipatory, and I think that's one of the key reflections we wanted to continue thinking about it. The second one is how to go beyond social justice. So we are here really talking about climatizing, if you want to talk about climatizing participatory action research. And how do we do it? How do we then integrate notions of climate justice then in participatory action research activities? So how can it deal with issues of the distribution of burdens, environmental burdens and opportunities? How can it deal with issues of representation related to the governance of environmental goods? And how can it be promoting a more caring relationship with people and the environment? And how can it also trigger processes of ecological restorations? So really, how can participatory action research then connect to those? And I think at the moment, most of the literature of participatory action research talks about climate change as an object of study, but not necessarily thinking about what is that within its operations that needs to be changed to become more sensitive and to be more inclusive to environmental concerns. And finally, my last point is around how do we go beyond knowledge traps, and how do we really address those asymmetries of power and the blind spots that are in the process of knowledge production through participatory action research. There is a very strong goal to deal with those epistemic injustices aspects. And I think for us, this is a reminder that we need to keep pushing ourselves how to think about other ways of generating knowledge that recognize those spaces that are not being part of the conversations, the types of knowledges that are not being part of the conversations, and that are so fundamental for us to include and to engage with and to see the world from, so that we can better respond to the ecological challenges that we are facing. And it's with that in mind that I think that Rose's contribution is going to be really interesting, and hearing her thoughts about her experience in Fiji, I think it would be very, very useful in dealing with some of those questions. I pass that back to you, Tristan.
Thank you very much, Alex, for laying the foundation so well for us on the underpinning the theoretical basis and also the steps that the process goes through. So I will hand over straight away now to Rosie, who will give our second presentation.
Bulavinak and greetings to you all. It's just 7:30 here in Fiji, and the sun is just trying to push its way out. So thank you, Alex and Charlie, for the opportunity to share briefly on our experience of participatory action research in Fiji, particularly focusing on the community engagement protocol and practices that's outlined in the paper that you're discussing today. I first read about participatory action research in my undergraduate curriculum development course as a method of addressing curriculum issues, where teachers work with colleagues and students to address relevant curriculum issues like literacy, discipline, gender, health, and multicultural classroom issues. But the protocol that that's outlined in the paper is derived from Nambombo Mbamba's 2006 Vanua Research Framework, and also Langi's Nambunyavala Research Framework, as well as from the community engagement experiences of the researchers who contributed in this paper. And the Fiji team consists of Felipe Vesa, Apollosa Rombaingau, and Sinivalo Pepa, who are all research students at the University of the South Pacific. And this tool was developed to guide us as we prepare for our participatory action research in one of the communities we are working with in Fiji as a part of the Climate U project. Now, there are protocols to be followed when entering and interacting and also leaving an indigenous Fijian community. And this is summed up in the 7 dimensions of community engagement. The community engagement tool can be used as a starting point for researchers or organizations that might want to work in Fijian indigenous communities. And the 7 dimensions or steps include proper planning and preparation. This is something that's very important to be done before we visit any of these communities. The reason is that, you know, the communities also have planned activities for the day. And if you have to go in, you have to make sure that everything is ready and that you have communicated with the relevant people, especially the chief and his spokesman in relation to your trip. As well as in Fiji, we have the provincial office that we need to also consult before we go into an indigenous community. Now, with COVID restrictions, I think this, you know, substantiates the reason that, you know, proper planning has to take place before entry into an indigenous community. And then as you enter the community, step 2 is the entry protocol, where we must request for entry with to the chief, and he will be able to help us identify the relevant people or the relevant clan or relevant tribe to work with in relation to the research or the project that we are going to implement. Having the approval of the chief will also facilitate the research or the project. And third is the Talanoa or Vitalanoa or stage. This is when the researchers or the project team are with the identified people to talk about the research or the project. Now, during this Talanoa or conversation, the rules of engagement are discussed, right? Who can we speak to, who we cannot speak to, where can we go? There are taboos also in indigenous communities that are going to be discussed and agreed to during this stage. Also, this is the stage where the research or the project is implemented. And in the Fijian community, as well as in most Pacific Island communities, Talanoa is one of the accepted culturally way of sharing information and also negotiating and making decisions. The next stage is the reporting. Now, after the research or the project, it is important that the research team or project team comes back to the community to report to them of what they have found, right? And it is during this stage that the members of the communities, because they are the owners of the knowledge, they will be able to identify to us what can be published and what can't be published, right? One of the reasons this is done is so that we can ensure that we disseminate valid information as well as respect the wishes of the knowledge holders. In stage 5 is gifting or reciprocation. This is also done at the end of the reporting. This is where we gift or reciprocate the community for the intellectual knowledge they may have shared, or sorry, with whatever they have contributed towards the research or the project. Now, during these stage, there's in the Fijian indigenous Fijian community, it's an oral culture. A lot of the gifting and the reciprocation is usually said not so much in what is given, but what is said. So it makes people happy, and also it builds the relationship of the researchers, project team, as well as the community. Now, after the reciprocation and gifting stage is the itatau, or the departure or temporary departure protocol. This is when the researchers or the project team will have to request to temporarily leave the research site or the community. This is also very important, so that you just don't leave abruptly after research. And also that during this conversation, the community will be able to give their blessings for the research team or the project team's journey. Now, I said temporary because usually the researchers or the project team would go back in the next stage, the 7th stage, to revisit the community and update them of the success of the project. It is also appropriate to go back and honor, or to honor the vanua or the community by informing them of the completion of a project and also its success, as I said earlier, and usually in appreciation of the success of the project, the community could organize what we call in Fijian Wakadir Salu, or feasting and dancing, to mark the success of the research or project. Now, the partnership and equal participation of the members of the community and the research project team ensures that the accepted intervention is justified by both the community and the researcher or the project team. That's why it's very important from the beginning to work with the community in planning, in requesting for entry, and also in conversing with them and identifying the most relevant intervention. Also, in partnering and having equal participation, both the community and the researcher or project team will be able to build a rapport or relationship, therefore trust each other and be able to exchange information, ideas, knowledge, and skills freely. In doing so, they agree on the relevant intervention to be carried out, which in turn will result in the resolution or the transformation of the issue of interest. In partnering with the community, the researcher or the project team will be able to build capacity and empower the community members so that when the project ends, the members of the community can confidently take ownership of the project and sustain it for the benefit of the community. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Rosie. And I was just thinking that you know, the principles that you've been putting forward there are I mean, beyond Fiji itself, would be a fantastic way for researchers to interact with communities in all contexts. It's a really really comprehensive and inspiring set of principles. Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Rosie. So we will move now to our response to the paper. Francis, I'll invite you now to make your comments. And could I just say, while she's doing that, please, if you have, you can start to put any questions or comments you have in your chat as we're going through, and I'll collect those. Over to you, Francis.
Mulavinaka, everyone. Thank you for the invitation to be with you today. Just as a very short preface, I suppose, for those of you who don't know me, I come to you after a long history in academia of 23 years and about 15 years of engagement in the development space, working around policy and community engagement. So the lens that I offer in my reflection are those of a Pacific Islander, a researcher, an educator, and a practitioner. First up, I want to say congratulations to the lead authors and to the research team for this impressive piece of work. In my view, participatory action research is often underutilized and its benefits poorly understood. So the deep dive provided by the authors is a critical guide for those just coming into this methodological awareness. An aspect that spoke to me in particular is the synergy with development work on futures thinking and building a theory of change, articulating the future we want to see and what we need to do to achieve that future scenario. The 4 indicators of empowered learning systems are reminiscent of the HOPE methodology that some of you may remember, designed as part of the Decade of Education for Sustainable Development around 2009. The HOPE evaluation methodology is an acrostic promoting PAR and speaking to sustainability indicators, which are holistic, promote ownership, encourages active participation, and empowers community, and therefore HOPE, and attempts to shift the focus from research subjects to active participants and bringing to the fore the transformative purposes informed by shared understandings of what social justice means. And we see here in both the paper and in the discussions today, the integration of indigenous knowledge approaches and methods with due consideration, as Rossi mentioned, to contextual ethics and protocol, expectations and relationships. But I think it's worth noting, though, that some would argue a true participatory approach ought to be underpinned by indigenous theoretical framing, indigenous philosophy, indigenous methodology, which then naturally lead into contextual approaches and indigenous methods. I generally lean into blended research, which I note the team has done in this case as well. And blended research as third space recognizes this added value that mainstream and indigenous research understandings bring to a special kind of multi-perspective lens that's otherwise quite difficult to achieve. The same critique, I think, is also relevant to the discussion around MEL. And in the development space, it's quite interesting. We've begun exploring Pacific monitoring, evaluation, and learning approaches that will complement mainstream evaluation methods. And again, utilizing this blended approach. As an educator slash researcher working in the development space, a very strange identity crisis, I suppose, my attention is drawn to the MEL learning cycle, which attempts to capture stories of transformation around the question, what has changed since this process began? And to this, I might add, what has changed as a result of this process? It's reassuring to note the emphasis around language, cultural competencies, research ethics, and ethos of community engagement, as well as the reminder about mediating power, privilege, and recognizing avenues for agency. And one of the key aspects of work, which I think is often underplayed, which I was very pleased to see highlighted, is the work by Chambers 2007, the guiding precepts, which emphasize the need to embrace research of vulnerability, openness and sincerity, humility and mutual respect, all of which are recognized as critical indigenous values in research undertakings. And I think that loops us back in a really nice way to Paulo Freire and what we might consider a critical awareness or conscientization of the researcher themselves. And as a visual thinker, I just want to add, I really appreciate the visual graphics and clarity in the way that the paper is presented. So thank you. In the university, climate change, adaptation, mitigation, and climate justice discourse, unfortunately, is so easily relegated to discipline or subject content. And for me, what this paper and presentation does is bring to the fore the criticality around grounded research that informs and is informed by scholarly work and is ultimately and necessarily both multi and transdisciplinary in nature. Universities as sites of knowledge and power, we do know, acknowledge their responsibility around ethical research practice, but we also know that this doesn't always translate into meaningful, inclusive, or participatory practice on the ground. Um, and added to that, in the context of climate justice, we can't deny the situated power that rests with funders or development partners who have a vested interest in research outcomes, and the same can be said for universities. In the not too distant past, I experienced firsthand the treatment of participatory action research work, which was deemed, quote unquote, too impactful for any real good and labeled unconventional. And many academics were encouraged to shift from impact work to the financially rewarding ranked journal outputs. For me, that moment was pivotal and solidified my own sense of purpose and identity as a Pacific scholar and researcher, confirming for myself why I do what I do. It also demonstrates a clear case of institutionalized epistemological racism. Ironically, it was work around the value of PAR and its intentions that the Academy did not value. And so it was extremely rewarding to read this paper and to listen to both Alex and Rossi today, to see the attempt to bring together a range of meaningful research outputs rather than just privileging one type of output over others. In coming back to the climate justice lens, we also need to consider premise foundations or key definitions. Where does the power sit in determining this? So when we talk about sustainable development, the SDGs, is the community actively thinking about and framing what it means in their understandings, their terms, their own language? Or are we simply well-intentioned, coming to community with predetermined foreign concepts in another language, defined by others for very different contexts, and therefore pursuing research as a power-driven act rather than the emancipatory one that we aspire to? When we speak of climate justice, again, what is our shared understanding? By whose definition and value judgments? Is the power situated somewhere between academia and the funding institution, or in the repositories of the UN and other development agencies? Or, as in this case, promoting PAR, is that part of the inception phase activity with the community? And I raise these questions not to undermine this critical piece of work. I guarantee I am going to use this and will recommend this paper to so many others. I ask these questions rather as a provocation about how we might further decolonize research. And I do so because the inherent institutional and epistemological racism and bias and the blind spots that Alex mentioned are all perpetuated in academia and development, and they push these boxes of thinking and marginalizes alternative ways of knowing, learning, being, and doing, even when we say we advocate for diverse perspectives and lenses. And so I ask a couple of questions. If we consider the different phases of the PAR cycle as presented by the authors, where might we expect emancipatory outcomes to spiral outwards into community-led initiatives and research activities that are community-driven? And if we, for example, look at the capacity building activities within the cyclic action planning, can we think about the added value of research capacity as empowered action learning, while at the same time being mindful of growing concerns and conversations around data sovereignty and citizenship generated data? From my own experience of lessons learned from multi-country projects, there are many contextual challenges which may be stressful, but also provide wonderful learning opportunities that we often don't hear about. And so coming from that firsthand learning experience, I want to raise the potential with the authors and researchers today for future research reflections and publication around dealing with some of the emergent challenges in the application of the PAR framework. Tool 4, action planning, makes mention of embracing the need for quick wins, addressing immediate challenges, and building energy for change. In the Pacific, silence speaks in layers of nuanced meaning, and it's not always easy to recognize or unpack immediate challenges. So I think that emerging researchers coming into PAR as a new innovative research space would definitely benefit from deeper contextual case study analyses that draw from a wide range of lessons learned, from successes and less than successful learning opportunities. Universities, academics, and scholarly research in the Pacific are often seen as disconnected from the lived experience. And I think unless more effort and investment is made into training and the use of PAR and better links forged between academia and development, I do fear that climate justice research will just reinforce the exclusivity of the powerhouse that the academy represents. I'm interested in exploring how we might ensure community empowerment considers issues such as traditional knowledge, intellectual property, and joint intellectual property, decision making for and by the community, and also how to ensure that certain expertise remains centered around community rather than at the shifting to the academy. And I know these are not easy questions, but I do think that we encounter many of these when we launch into deep participatory fieldwork. I think I'd like to conclude by just reiterating my sincere appreciation for the opportunity to respond and for the opportunity to listen to the presentations today. I do look forward to furthering discussions around the great work that the team is undertaking. So Vinakavakalevu, Malo Lava, thank you.
Thank you very much, Francis, for all those insightful reflections around the PAR process, epistemic justice, and also for presenting some challenges to the academy and to universities in listening to communities, learning from them, adopting indigenous frameworks, and some of the practical issues as well, the emergent challenges around community work. So lots of food for thought there. Before we open out for questions, I'll just invite Rosie or Alex to make any responses that they have to Francis's comments. And but let me, if I could invite the panelists now to turn on their cameras again and return, because the final discussion we will have between, we hope that Francis will also stay with us for the discussion. Please feel free to respond to any of the questions that come up from the other attendees as well. But first, on the basis of those comments, Rosie or Alex, would you like to make any immediate responses?
Well,
Go first, Alex. Yeah.
Are you? Well, I can start, Rosie, if you want.
Okay.
And well, fantastic, Rosie. Thank you also for your input. It was great to hear your presentation, and fantastic also reflections from Francis, generating so many food for thought here for us. And really, you've been very generous in your comments and your engagement with the paper and the work so far. So it was a pleasure to hear you. Thank you very much for your engagement so constructively. I think one of the you identified also some very complicated operations that a global project as this one is dealing with. It's one that comes from GCIF funding, which is problematic, as we know from the start, in terms of the use of resources, where it has been then taking away resources from development organizations and streamlining that through research organizations in ways that was a problematic process in itself. But it also opened up possibilities within that context for universities to also to encourage within its own space a more active engagement with the field in ways that I think has been interesting, but nevertheless in a very complicated space. And we are also in the context of ODA cuts as well in the UK, where this has been again a punch into the whole scene, the field. And also that the project is coping with that. Intersecting that, we have a COVID crisis that also made all of our inequalities so much more apparent and more bare in our faces, and which also resulted in many practical challenges in the ground. So yeah, it is a complicated context, as you identified, full of racism, full of patriarchy, full of climate injustices that we are navigating and having to operate through. But I think what is, I think, an exciting thing about this project as well is one that you have that solidarity between the groups and that political intention to, even within this context, to then try to navigate it and to help each other and support each other in trying to bring about change within their local areas. Is still focusing on that agency that those spaces could bring about without any naivety of what they mean as well at the same time. So just to say that I think that is a complicated journey, and to unpack all of that. And I think the questions around where is the emancipation lies. So where is the act of emancipation, that being for us as researchers, as universities, as the way that we do. And I think what is interesting is also that the object of the study here is the university system in itself. So it's a participatory action research that is looking into the university. And in some cases, communities, again, are engaging with this process with the intention that this is a way to then open up a space to exert influence into the university, and not necessarily only for the university as a way to bring about change elsewhere. So I think that's that act of, I think that site of impact being within the university system, I think opens up a very interesting space of reflexivity, and again, of exposing the vulnerabilities of university systems, as you picked up on Chamber's word, beyond as researchers, but of the institutions in itself, and the deficiencies that it has in ways that we can then work through them and hold to the trouble, right? So and not try to bypass it, but actually hold to it and work through it. And I think that's in terms of an ethos of the collaboration, I think it's a very important one, and a very exciting one as well. So again, thank you again for these comments, and I think it reminds us to bring the trouble back to the forefront of our work, and not sideline it, but actually talk through it, which I think it's something that have brought us together.
Thank you, Alex. Over to you, Rosie.
Thank you, Francis, for the response, and yes, thank you as well to the authors. For me, the publishing the tools and also on PAR is a starting point to make this methodology visible and appreciated. There's a lack of the use of this method in academia, and specifically here at the USP. But I think because we are engaging with communities, it is very important that we use this method instead of just the handing out of questionnaires and interviewing to quickly get data, analyze them, tick the box of the funders or the academic institution. The value of PAR, or participatory action research, must be acknowledged. And I think this paper is a starting point for us, especially for our team, as we will be going out into the communities, and not only the communities, but we are also working with the university, the Fiji National University and the University of Fiji. So this is a way of empowering the three universities and networking on how we can utilize this method to not only gain as academics, but also to give back to the community so that they can, benefit as well as sustain whatever work that we are going to do to ensure that we address the topic of interest or the issue of interest in the communities. Yeah, and I must thank you also, Francis, for the questions, because it's also motivating us, inspiring us on, to make sure that we don't just go and get, but not give back. Right? And you rightly said about the knowledge holders and specialists. It's important that we acknowledge those, and that's what happens in in the stage 2, where, you know, the rules of engagement are discussed, because there are open knowledge, closed knowledge, and negotiated knowledge that we can take from the community, but there are some that are just closed that we can never go there, right? So thank you, Francis, and thank you, Alex.
Okay, thank you very much. And we'll now move into the open question and answer. And you should see a raise hand button underneath your screen. I'm not quite sure what permissions everybody has, but if you don't see a raise hand button there, then if you just send a message through in the chat, and I will call on you. So please do feed through your questions and comments now on any aspect of this. And we'll start first with Winnie Joy. Winnie Joy, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, good evening and good morning. Yes, my name is Winnie Joy Gacheri, a research associate in the Kenyan team, Climate U project. Thank you so much for ordering this paper. Thank you, Alex and Charlie, for steering the authorship of the paper. And thank you so much for those who organized for this webinar. Thank you, Francis. Thank you, Rosianna and Alex, for your presentation, which is very inspiring. And thank you, Tristan, for allowing me to ask live this question. It's such a privilege. So, Rosianna, you did present about the steps that researchers should put into consideration when engaging communities, and they were very, very interesting steps, which made me think about it, and I could even see myself in a community and doing the processes that you're trying to explain. It was very captivating. So my question is, how are you able to compensate the community members for their time that they give in research, and as well ensure that they maintain the objectivity of the research itself? Yes, kindly shed more light on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Winnie. Now, before you enter, that is part of the planning. Before you enter into a community, we must do our research first as well. We should find out about their culture. You know, what are the acceptable way of compensating, of gifting in that specific community. From my experience, when I did my PhD, because it was, you know, it was such a big thing for me and my family. So when we went to gift back to the communities, actually, I used 3 communities. One of the cultural tool that is of significance in the indigenous Fijian culture is the tambua, or whale's tooth. And this was something I took back to the community to thank them for the tremendous work and the sharing that they have given. Now, the gifting before you leave could be, it depends, right? So you will have to know the culture well before you can choose the gift that you would like to give back to the community. But so long as what you're gifting to them is something that is acceptable and is of relevance to that community. Now, as I said, because the indigenous Fijian culture is oral, usually, you know, just thanking them. There's a specific way of thanking the community, and that you must learn as well. And that, for that reason, you must take someone who is familiar with the context to help you in that process. So that is how we select, how we compensate the communities. It's not so much money, but sometimes they might choose to, but otherwise it's what's relevant and what's most appropriate for the community. Therefore, we need to, we need to know the community well before we go in.
Thank you so much, Rosie. My only concern was, how are you able to maintain their objectivity on research despite, has there been a point in time when probably you found maybe there was a compromise in terms of them being focused on research, and they may be focused more on the gifting and the appreciation that they would get either after or before? And how would you deal with that?
Okay, I haven't had any experience, but in that, but oh, it just slipped my mind what I wanted to say. But otherwise,
but the problem is, I think, sorry, this is Jeremy with the University of the South Pacific. An example there, Rossi, would be, for instance, I think the high university regulations and policies are outdated and was there a long time ago in terms of research. For instance, you'll be questioned quite a lot because to things to do with food. Because in the Pacific Islands, cultural reciprocity involves food. And when you cannot go into the Solomon Island of a background, if you go, you cannot just swing your two hands and go to a Solomon Islands community to go and run some sort of activity. You have to take some food with you. And when you do that, I'm questioned in the last year for spending so much money on food because the university regulation is so outdated to the point where they question you if you're spending on food. But food is important, and those regulations were there. And I told the financial manager here at the University of the South Pacific, but you guys need to change those regulations. It doesn't fit into the Pacific Islands. You cannot swing your two hands and go to the Solomon Islands and try and tell the community to come over. You have to, they will be receiving there. They'll be prepared because you want to go there. And also you too, you have to be prepared going in. You cannot swing your two hands and appear there and have a conversation and a dialogue with the community. You cannot just do that. So, so that's one of my encounters last year as an example. Sorry, Rossi, I jumped into there, but that's an example, for instance, that regulation is outdated to the point where it doesn't really fit in the cultural context here sometimes, I think. Thanks.
Did you want to come back on that, Rosie, or Francis? Did you want to add anything to the discussion? Go ahead, Rosie. Yeah.
Thank you, Jeremy, for bringing that up. Yes, food is one of the most important aspects of any gathering in the Pacific. So yes, food and also just ensuring that the project is successful is one of the greatest gifts that we can give back to the community. Yeah. And Jeremy rightfully said about the question of how much we spend on food, and those are some important things that we consider before we go into communities as well, because food is going to be part of the engagement. Right? Without the food, the engagement won't be very successful. So maybe Francis can add more to that.
Thank you. I don't have that much more to add, except that I would agree with what Jeremy has raised, in that, and I attempted to diplomatically, and those who know me know I'm not known for my diplomacy around political issues, but I mean, I did allude to the institutionalized epistemological racism. And so when you talk about research ethics, while many of us at the university for the longest time have been talking about the critical importance of Indigenous research approaches, about meaningful community engagement, about impactful work, we simply do what everyone else does in the majority of the developing world, where we think that best practice is designed elsewhere by others for different contexts, and we're not going to even attempt to adapt. We're going to just adopt it as is. So for the longest time, our research human ethics guidelines had zero allocation for any of these required protocol. My own experience when I was doing the doctoral study was that there were questions around why I wasn't getting signed informed consent, which is, for anyone who does community work in Indigenous communities, knows that if you do follow protocol, traditional ceremony, etc., it's an insult for you to ask them to sign on a dotted line. There's also a legacy of being swindled out of land and etc. And people are very hesitant to sign things off if they're unclear of exactly what the fine print is. And in many instances, unfortunately, we have seen some progress in some areas around research ethics and a little bit of growth in these spaces, but I don't think that we've seen enough progress as we would like to see that actually allows researchers to engage meaningfully with communities and to engage in the kind of reflexivity that's built into the paper and the way that PAR is described in the paper. If we are talking about open, mutually respectful and mutually beneficial research engagement, then we need to understand the rules of engagement on both sides. And there must be that point of compromise in between. And if the rules of research don't allow that, then of course that's going to be a limitation to the quality of the engagement and limitations to the outcomes as well.
Excellent. So we'll move now to the next question, which is from Sonia Schwendler. Sonia, would you like to ask your question?
Yes. Thank you, Alexandre and Rosiana, and also Francis, for your fantastic reflections on decolonizing research and knowledge. Participatory research action based on Freire's emancipatory pedagogy, I can see this as a potential to challenge racist, colonized, and patriarchal epistemologies in the academia, and also to challenge these patriarchal cultures that still persist in indigenous and other communities. I have been working for a long time with landless workers women in Brazil, and related also to agroecology, to climate issues and so on. And I think this the work that we can do together helps in both sides. If you can do some reflections on this, how we, as academia, the communities helps academia to change, but also how the involvement of the academia with the participatory research action can help communities to challenge their own patriarchal and also colonized maybe values that stay in their communities. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sonia, for your question. Would anyone like to, any of the panelists like to come back on those points?
Maybe I start making some reflections from it. Just to pick up, I think, Sonia, thank you very much for your question. And I will also bring something I think Francis highlighted also, I think that relates to the complexity of this particular project, which is there are various asymmetries taking place at different levels in different relationships across this engagement. So, and I think we've been trying to think about this, the question around the epistemic injustices very much in relationship with our partners, and then trying to collaboratively trying to address that, thinking about even within our own teams, within our relationships, and how do we then can nurture ways of thinking that captures different ways of seeing the experiences that we are living in different places. At the same time, try to find where the synergies and where we pointed towards common challenges. What are the kind of issues that require collective alliances across geographies to be dealt with? What are the issues that we can draw from some collective alliance to act locally? So also thinking about the role of those different scales in these processes. But we also know that there are hierarchies beyond our immediate network, and I think that is the one that is also very challenging for us to engage with. And I think each team is going through their own relationships, and in each locality, as being based in London and others in each place, they also have their own hierarchies and epistemic asymmetries, that in terms of epistemic power asymmetries that is going on in terms of the process that is embedded in this research. And I think that's something that is a very important one for us to recognize and try to then to really reflect. Then, for example, in the scope of this paper, it has been mostly produced through us, through our collaboration, and we haven't really challenged our network in itself in terms of when we're thinking about this particular output. So then how do we then start destabilizing some of the comfort zones that we also have been able to generate, given which I think then would then start talking about, and I think that will be even a more complicated process, but then how do we then start building even potential conversations? I don't know if it's possible across communities of different localities, and trying to channel those spaces of dialogue, and that I think would be very interesting. And I think by highlighting, I think those different flows of conversation that could emerge out of a project like that, I think the questions that as the ones that you're bringing up are very important in terms of then how then asymmetries of power are being contested, revealed within communities, within universities, and how those collaborations can do that. And I think sometimes transiting across scales or geographies are useful instruments to do that, and to have conversations that are a little bit more uncomfortable, but with the slightly distance could be an interesting space to do that.
Great. Thank you. We have a question from Kaori Kitagawa. Kaori, would you like to ask your question live? If I'll just wait a few seconds. If Kaori is not able to join us, I will read it out. Okay. I think Kaori maybe can't join us with audio, so I'll read out your question, Kaori. So often in PAR, those who participate could be limited to certain members of the community. How can we ensure PAR enables participation of non-typical members whose voices are not heard? So how can we ensure participation of non-typical members? Any reflections on representation of all parts of the community? Rosie.
I think I've responded to Kaori. This is what's discussed before, during the planning of before you enter the village, because you have to discuss the purpose of your visit with the leaders of the community before you go. And in discussing this with them, you can inform them of the need to ensure that everyone is equally represented in the research or in the Veitalano. And this is again discussed during the rules of engagement discussion, right? Because it is important to have them involved so that their voices can also be heard. So that's how, from experience and also in the protocol that we have highlighted, how we ensure that everyone is involved and everyone's voices is heard in the project.
Thanks. Anyone else would like to respond on that one? Okay. We are do raise your hand if there are any other questions, but we are coming to the last few minutes of our session. We'll finish in about 3 minutes. So I wanted to raise an issue that in fact Francis mentioned, but it was also a provocation made by one of our advisory board members, Fatima Denton, in one of the I think it was the first webinar we had, and this was the question about, is PAR taken seriously by policymakers, by decision makers, others, who wield influence in society and are calling the shots in different ways. So is it taken seriously? And if not, what can we do to raise its profile and its influence as a research methodology, but also as a way of forming practice and policy and forming our societies as to embed itself and as a way of coming to collective decision making. So perhaps we can have a final round through the three of you. Please feel free to respond to that question or make any other final comments that you would like to make before we sign off. Perhaps we can go in the same order again. So I'll start with Alex, if that's all right.
So the question is, what we need to do to get PAR to be taken seriously? So I think that I think you're right, and I think Francis also highlighted the fact that within our institutions, I think there has been a series of challenges to PAI, and Francis, you experienced that yourself in your own work, taking away the legitimacy of what it brings about in relation to what is rigorous research. And I think one avenue for us is to then to reconstruct what is rigorous, valid research and engage in that conversation openly, and start trying to reformulate this architecture of the apparatus of research system, and trying to call for more, more pluralism and an expansion of the idea of what is rigorous research and procedures and systems. And I think that's a battle that we need to have with our donors, with the research institutions, with the regulatory bodies that are shaping our practice. And I think having that explicit engagement of that, I think, is one aspect of it. But I think there is another one that we probably shouldn't undermine, is that participatory action research is a reality. It's happening on the ground. People are doing within their relationships, within their neighborhoods, within their relationship with universities. It's something that actually once you start seeing that around you, and the amount of experiences that is actually existent, I think we shouldn't also undermine and also not recognize this incredible landscape that exists within popular research, popular knowledge systems. And I'm more involved in the housing context, and the amazing of the plurality of housing popular knowledge that is produced through everyday practice, through the legacy of what the pedagogy of liberation was in Latin America and the work in Brazil, where I do most of my work. It's incredible. It's incredible to see that living. So these forms of knowing and knowledge production is there, is being transmitted across actors that maybe are not the dominant actors, they're not the academics, but they are living entities. And I think recognizing those systems and maybe being humble enough to say, well, actually, it's about me trying to have a space to operate within those systems, to learn from them, and to see what can I do to make this system more operative, more inclusive, and to help this system of knowledge sharing, which is more within the popular knowledge and popular learning landscape. And maybe the big conversations around the high level UN multilateral, it's important, but maybe there's many other things happening as well at the same time that we should also be talking about those spaces. So that's from me.
Thank you, Alex. Rosie.
Well, for higher education or for institutions, higher education institutions, I think the starting point would be, as Francis highlighted, the ethics form. We need to review and include this. But first we have to try and influence the people in power to be able to do this, right? So we have to justify to them the need to ensure that this is in the ethics form, so that it brings out the essence or the values of PAR. As well as for the communities, I think with the communities the success of the project is what's very important to them, right? And that needs to be visible to the other communities in academia, in civil society, and internationally, so that they can know about the impact of PAR. And I think in one of our project activities, taking the video, the audio documentary, the video documentary, sorry, to COP is one way of relearning about the significance of PAR. Publicizing it widely will also be another way of influencing people to see the values and the importance and the significance of PAR, and most probably influence them to change their strategy or their method of dealing with communities in relation to research and projects.
That's great. And last but not least, Francis.
Thank you. I agree with the points that have been raised by Alex and Rossi, and I think the only thing that I would add would be we're already seeing PAR work happening in pockets in academia, I think increasingly so, as there is growing recognition of changes in the dynamics in society and the expectations of research. So we're seeing that the demand beginning to change our practice, perhaps not as quickly as we should, but definitely being pushed in that sense. But we're also seeing some really great work happening in civil society, as Rossi has mentioned, and in the development space. What we're not seeing, however, is the convergence of the different kinds of research that's happening. And so we're still kind of talking in silos. And I think that meaningful learning opportunities will come when we do create those spaces for cross research, for actually the sharing of research outcomes, and for the rethinking and perhaps unlearning or relearning what meaningful research outputs look like. And so multiple formats. So, rather than the academic research as in the days of old, sitting in a university library, being able to translate that into consumable language that the everyday person is able to understand, and meaningfully use to make informed decisions that improves the quality of their life. And so different stakeholders and different users are able to see the significance and benefit of the research that's being done. And I don't think that, well, I mean, as academics, to be fair, our work is quite demanding. um, and you really already do struggle to find the time to research and do the scholarly engagement in addition to everything else. And I don't think that our universities have been very good at perhaps marketing or branding research in a way that is seen across the different spaces as meaningful and useful. So still that kind of ivory tower, removed from reality perception. And I think that there is some work to be done in trying to bridge that gap. And perhaps the more we begin to engage with civil society, with our development partners, and with community, change will come, but it will need some active change agents to begin to kind of, I guess, champion the cause. And we are going to need to see more and more people using the same language. And once we do, you see that kind of momentum and movement begin to grow. So I think there's a lot that can actually be done. But the question would be, what would be that first spark or stimulus that brings like-minded people together into a shared space to just trigger the conversation? But I guarantee there'll be a whole lot of interest. If there were a symposium, for example, I'm sure you'd get a whole lot of registrations and interest from across the development space, civil society, as well as academia.
Thank you. And that's a great note to finish on. Thank you so much to all three of our speakers tonight or in the morning, depending on where you happen to be located around the world. Rosie, Francis, Alex, that was really fantastic. I think both inspirational, utopian thinking, but also very realist and pragmatic thinking about the challenges in practice as well. So it was a really fantastic session. Thank you very much for your contributions and to the questions that were raised as well for prodding us to think about these things in different ways. I put the website for the project in the chat, and the publications page, which has the working paper, was also put early on. Please do read it and the other working papers that are available, and do get involved in the project if you're interested. You can sign up for alerts. If you really want to get involved, you can join us as an affiliate researcher or even an affiliate institution. Get in touch if you're interested in that. I hope you'll also join us through the project to find out about how the PAR groups are getting on in practice. They'll be running for the next 18 months or so, and we'll be reporting back to you at various stages in the project on how things are going with some more concrete examples of these things happening. So we hope you'll join us then. Our next webinar, in fact, will be focusing on Kenya. I don't have the date for you, unfortunately, but watch this space. Watch this space. We will circulate the date for that. Jacqueline Niereri and team will be joining us to analyze policies around climate change and the responses of the higher education sector to that. So do join us then. Thanks again to our speakers, and have a very good rest of the day. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye.